connection has timed out, try again. Okay. PDF link. There's always a billion different things for link. A reminder to those who are coming in through YouTube, you can use the Zoom chat if you want to actually be part of more of the live interaction. And you can always type in the YouTube comments, the YouTube chat, in order to participate as well. So looking forward to seeing you one way or the other. We'll give it a few more minutes as people continue to log in. I know that everyone is a little getting back into the swing of things since we had 2 weeks that were off because of the Passover holiday. It may be a while before we get our full attendance back up. Hopefully everyone is doing well and had a good Pesach. It is nice to be back together again. We'll give it a couple more minutes as people continue to log in. In the meantime, please download the handout that has been put into the YouTube chat, as well as the... Hello? What happened to my picture? Okay. Please feel free to look at the handout, although don't look too much because, as you know, I like to go through it bit by bit. Check out the handout and also check out the link to Tazria for the Torah text that we'll be reading. Just going to wait officially until 12:05 to get going, just for people that are coming in a bit late. I see we've already got 5 on YouTube watching. That's great. Again, please feel free to use the Zoom link if you'd like to come in to the main Zoom room and join the talk and discussion there, or use the YouTube chat if you'd like to make yourself heard. And do remember, if you want to talk, to unmute your microphone.
Hello, Rabbi. My name is Loretta. I'm from California.
Hi, Loretta. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
Just one more minute and then we'll get things going.
Loretta, this is Charlene. How's the weather?
Actually beautiful. From where I live, it's getting up into the 80s and will be in the 90s this week.
And you can see the sky.
That I can. Very blue.
Which
I
part of,
remember it as a child growing up in Los Angeles and San Diego.
which part of California do you live in?
I live in the Central Valley right now in Fresno. I grew up in Monterey County, so that was always beautiful weather. Here I moved closer to my son once I retired, so it's getting used to it.
Yes. I went to university at the University of the Pacific at the top of the valley, up in Stockton.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Then you'd be aware of the very hot weather.
Yes. People always tend to think of California as just being the beach postcards.
Oh no.
It's a rather enormous state.
That it is.
All right. Well, I think we've given our cushion enough time to get going. So we are going to get down to our Torah reading. And that means I just have to click on the correct buttons to get in. Okay. Hopefully everybody is now seeing the section taken from Leviticus 12. We are in Tazria Metzora, which is a double parasha. However, we're only going to be looking at the beginning of Tazria. And this is a section that doesn't get a lot of screen time. A lot of people, when they're studying through the Torah, when they hit this particular section of the Torah, they begin flipping pages because on the one hand, it's about topics that people don't like talking about, which is to say issues of bodily and spiritual purity. And on the other hand, it's because it's rather confusing. And I've noticed that a lot of people prefer to skip that which is confusing rather than confront it. So we're going to go through it. We're going to see what it says on the page, and then we're going to see how that's been understood by our tradition, both in the technical term as well as in the spiritual of why this is the way it is. With that in mind, let's go ahead and get down to work. Okay, I'm trying to see if I can center that a little better. Is it? Nope, it's just going to be very twitchy. All right. We're starting on chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity." All right, so a lot of things that have to be in decompacted here, unfolded. So first of all, the term that's used for childbirth is a little bit more idiomatic than the translation gives us. It's the word Tazria, from which the parasha derives its name. And it could be perhaps more literally written as when she brings forth seed. A zera is an actual seed, like the kind you would plant in the ground. And we'll come back to this idea of seeding that takes place during the conception. But really what's being described here is that when she is bringing forth offspring, and the offspring is a male, then she shall be unclean. Now, again, uncleanliness in the biblical terminology here has nothing to do with physical uncleanliness. This is not like, I have gotten myself dirty in the mud. This has to do with a spiritual state that is significant really only because of the barrier that then exists between a person in this position and performance of certain sacrificial rites. And the period is 7 days. And that type of uncleanliness is handled in the same way as the uncleanliness of nidah, which is the menstrual monthly cycle, meaning it would follow the basic same rules of separation from intimacy with her spouse and the like. Going on the 8th day of the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, what we know as Brit Milah. And then it continues the narrative of her status. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. Now, that seems confusing enough, but what's going to make this all even more confusing is if she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. Those of you who are very quick with your math will notice that the duration seems to be twice as long for the birth of a woman, birth of a girl child, as it is for the birth of a boy, of a male child. That's going to have to be explained, of course, by our commentaries. But this notion of blood purification is difficult to understand in the Torah text by itself. As I often like to say, for people who say, oh, I read the Bible literally, verses like this confound any literal reading. You know, what does it mean to say blood that is pure? Right? That doesn't actually mean something in and of itself without context and without a communal structure of a shared meaning. And that shared meaning, of course, has been transmitted through our commentaries, and we will get to it. But before we do that, let's scroll down just a little bit. We're going to pick up at verse 6. On the completion of her period of purification, for either a son or a daughter, the 33 or 66 days, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be clean from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf, and she shall be clean. All right, expiation is the fancy word for atonement. And indeed, the word that's used in the Hebrew is the consistent word, v'chiper, which is the same word for Yom Kippur. It's derived from the same root, of course. So she is bringing these 2 sacrifices. And you'll notice the sacrifice is the same regardless of the gender of the child. And these are brought at the end of that pure period. And then if she can't afford, she is able to bring a sacrifice of reduced cost. Okay, so questions or comments so far? So we can all see why people don't generally want to study this section, right? What's going on with the blood? What's going on with purification? What are the sacrifices about? It's just all a little foreign. It's almost like this was a book that was written 3,000 years ago in a different culture, which of course it was. However, I do like to point out that we have a strong chain of that culture that continues to this day. So although it may be foreign, it is not unintelligible. Yes?
How did, this is Charlene, how did they test this? I mean, did she just say, I'm okay now? Or, I mean, how did they have some kind of an examination or something like that?
So how do you know what a woman's state is vis-a-vis her blood?
Right.
So that is an excellent question, and it is one that is often overlooked when people are reading through these different sections. The way that it is normally done is the woman would test herself. This goes, of course, for the monthly cycle as well. And when the woman says she's clean, she's clean.
Okay, so
there wasn't a a position of the officer of the examining of women for their current state.
So her word was enough.
Well, yes. Now, if there was a doubt, if a woman had a sign of some discoloration that she wasn't sure if it was part of the blood flow or not, then that could be presented to a sage for examination, and that continues to this day, where they would examine the coloration and the type in order to let her know whether it was a blood or whether it was some other type of discharge. But that was only if she couldn't identify it herself.
Okay, thank you.
But that's going to come back a little bit more in a bit, because right now I would imagine that if you were reading this for the first time, or even maybe the second, you would probably think that this period between the birth of the child till the bringing of the sacrifice, that she is in a state of completely like nida, completely separate from her spouse, and unable to be intimate, and going through the normal distancing that took place each and every month. If you thought that, you would be wrong. That is not exactly what is going on here. In fact, there's a much more complicated system that's being described in these verses of off again, on again, with certain limitations being added throughout this period. And we're going to unpack that with the help of our commentary. So let me go ahead and switch the screen. Reading controls, and then I go to a new share. Sorry, as I continue to get used to this. There we go. All right. Can everyone see now the text for our commentary? Okay, good. So we are going to start off with this question of why is there this separation? Why is there this this activity happening at all? What in the world is happening with this distinction between male and female? But before we get into some of the answers for that, I wanted to start with a quote from the Talmud from Nida 31a, which gives us a little bit more of at least of a feeling of wonder that we should have when it comes to the birth of a child at all. As it says, this is along the lines of what Rabbi Elazar said. What is the meaning of this verse? Who does wondrous things alone, and blessed be his glorious name forever, taken from Psalm 72. Even the one for whom a miracle is done does not discern the miracle that has been done for him. Meaning, even somebody who is giving birth to a child and who can feel that there's something wondrous has happened, do we really know what happened? Do we really know the full miracle that was involved in bringing that child into this world? And even as we have unpacked and unraveled so much of the science of what goes into conception and as well as gestation and birth, we still barely understand how it is that the basic atoms and molecules of the universe can combine together to create this amazing thing that is a new life and have it come out into this world. So there is a certain humility that we should always approach when trying to discuss some of these questions, which is going to lead us to another passage from Nida, from the Talmud, where they're going to try and uncover why is it that there is a difference between the uncleanness and cleanness, as they refer to it, between a male and a female. So we're going to go to our second text. Rabbi Ishmael said, the Torah has declared a period of uncleanness and then cleanness with reference to a male, and it has also declared a period of uncleanness and cleanness with reference to a female. We'll get back to those two periods in just a section. Just as, in the case of the male, when the Torah has declared a period of uncleanness and of cleanness, the periods correspond to the time in which he is fashioned. So, when the Torah has declared a period of uncleanness and of cleanness, the periods correspond to the time in which she is fashioned. What Rabbi Ishmael is trying to say here is that in his interpretation, what the Torah is telling us about this 33 and 66 day period is that corresponds to the length of time it takes for the gestation of the child to form into a male or form into a female. Basically, he is hypothesizing or believes that he has deduced from the Torah that it takes 33 days for the male fetus to become male, and it takes 66 days for the female fetus to become female. That there are different timelines of creation of the child within the womb. Everyone following that? Okay. They said to him, meaning the rest of the sages, the period in which a fetus is fashioned is not to be derived from the period of uncleanness. They're like, what are you talking about? There's an interesting interpretation you've got there, but that does not necessarily connect to the reality of what's happening in the womb. They said, there was a case of Cleopatra, queen of Alexandria, everybody, of course, knows Cleopatra of Cleopatra fame, whose slave girl was condemned by the state to death, because that was the sort of thing they did back then. They examined her, meaning after she was dead, they cut her open and examined the fetuses within the slave girl, and found that both the male and the female were formed by the 41st day. Turns out that the formation, where it can actually be detectable by the naked eye, happens by the 41st day, and it doesn't seem to be gender dependent. I present proof to you from the Torah, and you present proof to me from idiots. Rabbi Ishmael's rebuttal is, look, I'm giving you Torah proof. You're giving me the hearsay of some person who would cut open the dead slave that had been executed by the state. Which one is more reliable? Well, the sages respond, all the same, the process of the formation of the male and female, both are completed by the 41st day. Meaning that in the end, the sages go ahead and accept that the proof of the surgery that was done is stronger proof than Rabbi Ishmael's interpretation of the Torah verse. It's important to remember that in all places where we have solid empirical evidence, we do follow that when trying to understand and apply Jewish law. Even if it may seem to go against another valid sounding interpretation of the verse, if we have physical external evidence, we use that extensively to try and make sure that how we apply the Torah actually matches with how God has made God's world. All right, so that was attempt number one at trying to tell us why there was a difference between boys and girls for the period after birth. Attempt number one, because they formed differently, but that attempt got shot down. Any questions on attempt one? All right, let's move on to attempt two. This is taken from Sefer HaChinuch, but it's heavily derived, or heavily corroborated, I should say, by Ramban, that's with an N at the end, also known as Nachmanides. And the conception of a female indicates coldness in the constitution of the female, meaning the mother. Okay, so let's just back up here for a quick second. When we say coldness, we are not talking about coldness in the modern psychological term, right? Nowadays, people will say, oh, she's a very cold person or she's a very warm person. And what they're talking about there is whether they are sort of extroverted or introverted, whether they are compassionate or whether they're uncaring. We have a big fuzzy zone in our language on how we use these terms in the modern world. In the Middle Ages and prior, coldness and dampness and heat and dryness, these were medical terms that were used extensively throughout the ancient, classic, and medieval world to try and describe what they believed were some of the underlying mechanisms within a body that would make it healthy or sick. And different types of imbalances, being too cold or being too hot, being too wet or too dry, would then suggest different, what we would probably now call homeopathic remedies. So what they're talking about here is that if the mother has too much coldness in her constitution, in her health, then she is going to conceive a girl rather than a boy. Why? And in coldness, excesses abound, right? Meaning there is too much. Whenever you're too cold, you're holding in too much. And hence, she needs 2 weeks for cleansing of her body. So because she gave birth to a child, to a girl child, we now know that her body was excessively cold, and therefore she needs the 2 weeks to detox from that excess coldness that was in her. And he goes on to say, Sefer HaChinuch, and so did I find the matter after I wrote this, meaning he'd written this first because of his own medical knowledge, and he's found it also in Ramban, may his memory be blessed, and these are his words, and this is Ramban on Leviticus 12:4. Because the constitution of the female is cold and wet, and the dampness of the womb of the mother is very great and cold, and therefore she gave birth to a female. And hence she requires a big cleansing because of the multitude of dampness and the blood decaying in her, and because of her coldness. And it is well known that the cold sicknesses require a longer time to be cleansed than the hot ones. Okay, now it's well known in their day and shape, as hopefully you're all aware. In the modern world, this is not so well known. that the idea of there being these different cold and hot and damp and dry constitutional factors is not part of modern medical practice. And that means that this attempt to explain the differences is also going to be a bit of a strikeout, because there's no reason to believe that there was anything biologically different in the mother during the conception and carrying of a girl to term than there was in the conception and carrying of a male to term. So we do get kind of another strikeout on this explanation. However, now that we've had two different explanations, we can begin to see something which is always an important pattern to note, which is when you have two explanations, each of which are not necessarily claiming to be grounded in a received Torah tradition, but instead are grounded in the either rational interpretation of Torah or rational interpretation of the human body. That means that there was no received Torah tradition of exactly why there was this demarcation between boys and girls. Whenever you find this type of multiple explanations, neither one of which claims to be as embedded within the antiquity of our tradition, you can recognize that they too were struggling and each came to their own satisfactory explanation, but that explanation does not then become binding upon all the other commentaries out there. Does that make sense? That is very important to keep in mind whenever you're studying and you come across different explanations like these, to realize that you've now entered into a topic or a zone in which there is not a clear received tradition that goes all the way back to the ancient world, but instead is a bit more of the Wild West of interpretive explanations. One other thing that you may be interested to know, if you've ever wondered why do we call it having a cold when somebody is sick, it is because of this type of ancient medical thinking. Because after all, there's nothing about being cold which gives a person a cold. But this is the origin because of how they believe the different humors of the body were being affected. Onward, unless there were other questions or comments. All right, so let's get back to how did the rabbis actually believe that conception happened? What happened in their mind when a child was being conceived? This is again back in the Talmud from Nida 31a. Our rabbis have taught 3 form a partnership in the creation of a human being. The Holy One, blessed be He, one's father, and one's mother. 3 people. The father contributes the semen, from which the bones and sinews and nails and brain and white of the eye come. What do all those things have in common? If no one wants to take a stab at it, they're all
white.
They're white, right? So they're saying, look, semen is white, bones are white, sinews are white, so are nails, so is the brain, so is the white of the eye. This must all come. And they literally believed that these parts that would then expand to be the child were in the semen itself. Those were component parts. On the mother's hand, on the other side, she provides the red, meaning the blood that we see within a woman and the additional lining of the womb that would be seen each time a woman menstruated. That's the red they're referring to. From this, the skin, the flesh, the hair, the blood, and the dark of the eye come. Why? Because all of those things are more of a ruddy coloring, of a darker complexion. So things that are red and pink and all of that comes together from the mother. You put these 2 things together, and now you actually have a human being. Except you don't. If you put those 2 things together, you have a human animal, but you don't actually have the human being. Why not? Because that's where part number 3 comes in, which is God. The Holy One, blessed be He, supplies the breath of life and the soul, the identifying features, eyesight, power to hear, ability to speak and walk, understand and discern. What are all of those things? How are those all connected? What's the distinguishing feature of those elements that are coming from God?
They make us human. They make
Exactly.
us the person who we are.
They make us the person we are, right? Not just the human animal. That's the mother and father's contribution, but the things that make us distinctly human as opposed to other animals. And on top of that, these are also things that are intangible, right? These are things that you can't touch. You can't touch the power of sight. Yes, we have an eye, and yes, we can actually, see how the eye works, but to understand vision, vision is technically intangible. It is some process happening within our conscience, within our sentience. The same thing with the breath of life, the same thing with the soul. All of these things are what make us uniquely human and not just animals. And these are all intangible things. And when time comes along to take leave of the world, meaning when a person dies, the Holy One, blessed be He, takes back his share. And the share of the father and mother, he leaves with them. Which is a polite way of saying the soul and all the things that make us uniquely human, that goes to God. And all the things that are just the material animal components, those go back into the earth. Right? God leaves the body behind, but the parts that are uniquely human to each of us, those are taken to God. The body is then buried and mourned for, but the soul and all of the unique human elements, those are maintained forever in a divine realm. This is along the lines of what Rabbi Elazar said. What is the meaning of this verse? Who does wondrous things alone, and blessed be his glorious name forever, our initial starting verse. Even the one for whom a miracle is done does not discern the miracle that has been done for him. Trying to let us know that when you give birth to a child, you may look at the child and think, oh, look, he has my eyes, he has his mother's nose, he takes after his grandfather, all of these things. But the true essence of the human being really came from God rather than from the parents. Questions or comments? While I have a sip of tea. Okay, moving on to our second page, in case you wanted to print this out. All right, so let's go back to this whole 7 and then 33 and 14 and 66. Let's come back to this this question of counting and what was really going on here. So we're ducking back into Sefer HaChinuch in order to try and unpack this a bit. So after she gave birth, the woman counts 7 days from the day she gave birth, as we saw in chapter 12 in Vayikra and Leviticus. And whether she gave birth at the beginning of the night or at midday or even near sunset, she counts that day of birth as 1 day and completes 6 more days upon it. This is, by the way, the standard practice for Jewish counting, is that we count part of a day as being a day. This happens when it comes to funerals, this happens when it comes to birth, and it comes for Brit Milah, as we'll see. And whether she experiences blood a few of the days of the 7 or all of the 7, she immerses on the evening of the 7th, which is the 8th night, and she is pure for her husband. So meaning that the night of the 8th, which is the beginning of the 8th day, not the end of the 8th day, remembering Jewish days begin in the evening, not the morning. So she counts 7 days, and even if she was still having blood, she goes to the mikveh, and now she is considered pure, meaning that they can be intimate together. And even if she is gushing blood on that 8th night, she immerses and is pure for her husband. As the Torah permitted all blood that a woman has given birth, we'll see, after the 7 days, within the 33 days for a male, and after 14, within 66 days for a female. Okay, so I really wish I had my my whiteboard behind me, because this is something that would really help for a timeline, but I'll do the best I can with my hands, so follow the hands. So what this is saying is that based on our text from Leviticus, and if you read it with this in mind, it actually is very clear that there is a period of separation of 7 days if it was a boy, 14 days if it was a girl. And during that time period, as anybody who's given birth will know, it is very, very common for there still to be more discharges, for there still to be additional blood coming from the womb as the womb finishes the process of well, birth, of having the child having left. Now, during that time period, there may be a little, there may be a lot, it may be some of the days, it may be all of the days, but on that 8th night, the beginning of that 8th day, she can go to the mikveh, and she is now considered to be ritually pure. And most importantly, as we'll see, that means she can be with her husband again. Everyone following? And those numbers are doubled for a girl. And the question then becomes, well, wait a minute. After the 7th day and after she's gone to the mikveh, if she is still bleeding, doesn't that mean that something is wrong, not medically, but wrong in the sense of an impure discharge? Wouldn't this be like a zava or a nida? Wouldn't this be like the monthly cycle then? Or wouldn't this be like an irregular discharge? At which point she would need to be separate from her husband. And the answer is no, because the Torah said that during this period, her blood is pure, right? That's why the whole term blood purification is a little misleading, because the blood purification, by what the rabbis understood, meant is that the blood was pure as opposed to waiting for purification. So this blood is not a problem. And yes, obviously, if there's a medical issue, then they need to be seeing their doctor and taking care of that. But if it's just a regular occasional sign of additional blood, the husband and wife do not need to separate from each other during this time period, as they would if it were not during this window. About this, the sages, that is, they may their memory be blessed, said that there is one wellspring, and the Torah made it impure, and the Torah made it pure. The wellspring, the place where the blood comes from, is the womb. And sometimes what comes out of the womb renders a person ritually impure, and sometimes what comes out of the womb does not render a person ritually impure. The Torah can do that, meaning to say that the blood of birth that the Torah made impure and the blood of purification that the Torah made pure are from one place. And that is, both of them come out of the same source, the uterus, which is a place of impurity. However, the Torah made the matter depend on time, and made impure the blood that comes from her at one time, and made it pure at a second time. And the Blessed One that knows all wisdom, as he did everything for a correct and necessary reason. All right, which is a very good reminder of the humility that we need to have with all of this, which is, you might think logically, well, if the blood is coming out, then that means ritual impurity, because it means ritual impurity in these other common cases. But no, even though that might make logical sense to you, that doesn't mean it makes logical sense to God, because God has an understanding that goes beyond our understanding. And we can throw up our hands and say, look, we don't really know exactly why God made it work this way. We can try different theories like Rabbi Ishmael did and Ramban did, but ultimately we're not 100% sure exactly why this is happening the way it is happening. And instead, we have to go with what God told us to do, rather than our own reasoned understanding of it. And blessed is the one that knows all wisdom, as he did everything for a correct and necessary reason. And blessed be he knows that up to a certain time, the blood is damaging, and that from then on, it is not damaging. But now, all of Israel has girded itself and is accustomed to treat the blood of purification like the blood of impurity. So what he adds at the end is what had become the common practice, and indeed continues to be the common practice in the Jewish world at this time, which is, yes, God gave permission for the husband and wife to be together, but most communities don't actually do that. Most communities continue to have a separation during the following 33 or 66 days, and have just taken that as being their own additional stringency that they have willingly embraced, rather than that it was imposed by the commandment. Questions or comments on this? I know it's a quiet group. I can't wait till we get back in the classroom and I get more people freely talking, but everyone seems to be afraid of the camera.
Well, There's such a clarity here that is surprising me. I appreciate it. I was more of the other thought. This is interesting. I like it's makes a lot of sense.
Hmm. I agree. You know, our people have been thinking about these things and using our traditions for a very long time. And thankfully, many of them were absolute geniuses at writing things out clearly. And Sefer HaChinuch is a great one for trying to make complicated things a little bit easier to understand for the rest of us. And indeed, it's just a great reminder of how much we should rely on those guides from other people, but also why we wouldn't rely on only one guide, because even the geniuses among us sometimes interpret things a little differently. As you can see, he did slip in the belief that ultimately the separation had to do with whether the blood was healthy or unhealthy, which of course is not said in the Torah. The Torah doesn't indicate that there is unhealthy blood and that's the reason for any separation. But that was, you know, his interpretation based on his days. It's interesting, you'll find in the modern world, many people will refer to psychological reasons as why there is separation. That when there's more separation, then, you know, absence makes the heart grow fonder and it helps them reunite in a way that is more powerful than if they were always together, which is essentially using our modern medical ideas to try and interpret what we see from the Torah as well. And certainly that is generally true, but it is still an additional interpretation rather than from the Torah itself. So we're left with trying to figure out why there still is this separation between 7 and 14, between the boys and the girls. And like I said, we're not going to get a perfectly clear answer for this. If we were, it would have been at the top of the page. But one interesting interpretation that I found was from Bechor Shor, who gives an explanation of why it had to be earlier for boys. Rather than thinking of it had to be later for girls, he sort of emphasizes it the other direction. Everyone is supposed to enjoy themselves on the day of Brit Milah, right? The day of circumcision is meant to be a day of simcha, a day of joy. And if it's a day of joy, you need to be able to enjoy yourself. But until the mother immerses, until she goes to the mikveh, she and her husband are forbidden to each other, which impedes their joy. Either the joy of being together or even the potential of being together for husband and wife is something that is so fundamental to the relationship that if you try to have a simcha without that opportunity, at least, even if you're not availing yourself of it, then it does take away a little bit of the celebration of the day. And so since the Brit Milah has to be on the 8th day, given the health of the child, then we needed to make sure that she could be ready to have that intimacy again, not forcing it, but at least the potential was there for them to be close to each other. Then that meant that you had to speed things up in the case of a boy in order to be able to celebrate the Brit Milah fully and happily, which I thought was a very nice way of looking at it, since usually people look at it as the girl is being delayed or there's something more about the girl. It was no, we had to speed things up on the boy because, well, you know, we had to let them be together. All right, which leads us to the other thing, which was rather unusual, which is the whole idea of the Brit Milah was an interruption. When we were reading through chapter 12, you may have noticed that the verse that talks about the 8th day of circumcision sort of comes out of nowhere. It's like there's going to be this 7 days and da-da-da-da. Oh, and by the way, circumcise. And then there's going to be 33 days and blah, 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 and sacrifice. It's like, why did you interrupt me to tell me to circumcise? Didn't I already know this from Abraham? It just sort of comes in, it interrupts the flow of the narrative. So Bechor Shor is giving one explanation, which is that it interrupts because it had to interrupt the process in order to make sure husband and wife could be together. But the second text here, taken from the Midrash Tanhuma, is giving us a different explanation of why we would want to remind ourselves of circumcision, even as we are celebrating the birth of the child, or in the Torah, why we are talking about the child. So Tyrannus Rufus, which is one of my favorite names ever, who was a wicked person, asked Rabbi Akiva, which works are more beautiful, those of the Holy One, blessed be he, or those of flesh and blood? Now, you might imagine, of course, any rabbi is going to say God's works are better than the works of flesh and blood. But Rabbi Akiva said to him, those of flesh and blood are more beautiful. Like, what a minute, wait, you're saying that what humans make is better than what God makes? Tyrannus Rufus, the wicked, said to him, look at the heavens and the earth. Are you able to make anything like them? Which is, you have to admit, a pretty good argument. Rabbi Akiva said to him, do not talk to me about something which is high above mortals, things over which they have no control, but about things which are usual among people. It's like, well, look, if you want to compare creative beauty, don't talk about things that humans can't create. Talk about things that humans could create and that God can create, and then we'll do a comparison to see which is more beautiful. Right? It's otherwise it's an unfair competition. So he said to him, fine, why do you circumcise? Interesting attack at this point. And Rabbi Akiva replies, I also knew that you were going to say this to me. I therefore anticipated your question when I said to you, a work of flesh and blood is more beautiful than one of the Holy One, blessed be he. And Rabbi Akiva illustrates this. Bring me wheat spikes and white bread. He said to him, Rabbi Akiva still, the former, the wheat, right? The stalks of wheat. These are the works of the Holy One, blessed be he. And the latter, the loaf of bread, this is the work of flesh and blood. Is not the latter more beautiful? Right? Which do you actually prefer, raw wheat or bread? Most people are going to prefer the bread. Now, we can, in a modern world where we are flush with food, many of us perhaps too much, maybe we are a little distant from what Rabbi Akiva was trying to say here. But for a person to look out at waving wheat, there is a certain aesthetic beauty. But for a person to look at a beautiful loaf of bread, there is a beauty that says this is good and will sustain me in a way that allows me to not starve to death. That is a much more powerful emotional response if you've ever actually experienced true hunger. I can say that I have a few times, accidentally ended up not eating for an extended period of time. And when you finally sit down with just a raw loaf of bread, it is one of the most amazing things ever. It has a completely different effect on you emotionally than a piece of bread does on a regular day. Much like I think many people feel about it right after Pesach. So this loaf of bread is more beautiful. And yet we made the loaf of bread. God did not. Now, what does this have to do with circumcision? Tyrannus Rufus said to him, inasmuch as he finds pleasure in circumcision, right? If God likes circumcision so much, why does no one emerge from his mother's belly circumcised? Right? If God wanted everybody to be circumcised because that was better, because that was more beautiful, that was the finished form, like the loaf of bread, then why doesn't God just make people circumcised? Why give them a foreskin if it's just going to get removed? Rabbi Akiva said to him, and why does his umbilical cord come out on him? Does not his mother cut his umbilical cord? So why does he not come out circumcised? Because the Holy One, blessed be he, only gave Israel the commandments in order to purify them. Therefore, David said, the word of the Lord is pure. What he is saying is that, yes, God could have made us all circumcised from birth. God could have made us without umbilical cords and no need for cutting those. God could have made it so that we all just spontaneously popped into existence next to our parents. God did not need to make the laws of creation as he did. God chose to make the laws of creation as he did. And the way those laws are laid out, there are matching laws of Torah that allow us to interact and to embellish, to improve, and to complete the act of God's creation. This is where we become the partners of God in creation. And we are no more the partners of God's creation than in the case of birth. When we are actually creating the next generation, and when we are taking upon ourselves the responsibility of raising a child and of educating it and caring for it, this is the ultimate act of us imitating God and continuing that process of creation and hopefully making each generation a little better than the one that preceded it. This is one of the great gifts. When we follow the words of God, when we follow God's commandment, we are purifying the world. We are making the world better and better as we go on. And this act of birth, this act of creating a new life, should be one of the most powerful mysteries that we have that inspire us to continue to live in a beautiful and ever more perfect way as we go forward. Any questions or comments? Okay, then I guess we will leave it there for the week. It's good to be back, even if it's only through the screen. We will continue next week. We don't have a holiday for a while, so hope to see everybody next week. A reminder, our Mishnah class is back on this evening at 7 p.m. and tomorrow's Pathway to Judaism is also on at 6 p.m. And those should continue at their regular times for the foreseeable future. And I'll keep you updated if anything changes on social distancing rules or anything like that.
Thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us.
Well,
All right, everyone.
Bye.
Take care and be safe.
Joshua?
Yes.